Hi and welcome to my GAMMANS Art YouTube channel. This week I'm going to show you something a little bit different. It is a cityscape piece which I haven't done in a really long time, so I'm hoping that it'll be interesting for you guys to see how I've done it. I'm going to start with mapping out the composition and explain what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and I'm going to show you how the buildings are formed and the drippy bits down the side and just how it gets from A to B. I'm also going to do little zoom in photographs of what's going on as well, just so it's a little bit clearer to see as I'm going. Also, this one took me a really long time, so I have really time-lapsed it, so it's quite fast. And also, that's where the images kind of come into play as well, because they're going to give you little updates when perhaps like I couldn't film absolutely everything I've been doing. I really hope that you enjoyed this video, and please do like and subscribe and give it a big thumbs up. That would be really helpful. And also I hope you guys appreciate my t-shirt. This is my painting outfit. Also really humorous to my friends when I rock up to places with paint all down me, so there's a little shout out to them. Thank you so much for watching and enjoy. So I've already drawn out a rough composition, and that includes the two bridges that I'm going to be painting and also the embankment area towards the left hand side of the piece. In the last video I did, I think you guys would have watched me paint the drippy bits at the side of this piece, so I'm just going to recap over that just so you can see how it works from start to finish. But I'm just building up that green and the turquoisey colours too, and just really making sure to blend the tones in and making sure that it all works as a whole piece. I usually start working on the sky as soon as I possibly can, really, just because it's such a important part of the painting and it really needs to be right before I start doing everything else. So I do tend to do that bit relatively quickly, and I'm just sort of getting that Nepal yellow and the white, the fast dry white, which I love, and mixing that with a little bit of pink, a tiny bit of pink to get that peach colour, and that's going to form the basis of that bright sunset colour. I'm using that dark teal colour as the sky because that's what the darker more shaded areas of the painting are going to be, and they're going to be in that colour. So it's the same thing I usually talk about, where I'm trying to mirror the colours around the piece to bring it together as a whole. So for example, the background of the building area, which you can see in the left hand side of the piece, is going to be that teal colour too. So I'm just reflecting that into the sky, and it's just a lighter version of the turquoise that you can see in the water. And what's really nice too is that when the light yellow colour and that teal colour combine, they do create this really nice colour of sort of, it's almost like a citrusy yellow green, and that's really nice, and that makes also the painting work as a whole because it's those two colours combined with each other, so they're very tonally compatible. You can see as well that I filled in between the teal sky and the burst of sunshine that's going to form the sunset colour. I have used like a purpley bluey colour that's also going to be a really big part of the piece too. And I've also dragged it down as well underneath the reflection. So the reflection progresses and changes in tone as the sky does. So it's really supposed to be a reflection of that. So you can see that the colours, the light peach and then the purple lilac colour, are also reflected in the water too. I'm just using variations of the teal colour to highlight that reflection and to create some depth and some distance, and also just use it as shading because I don't really go a lot darker than that colour. I mean, I do use some dark blues, which you'll see me use later, but that's going to be the sort of the darkest of the main colours of the piece. But the main process here is just to sort of be covering that canvas with shades of background colour and just really create a nice setting for the detail that I'm going to add in later with the bridge and the embankment and the lights and the twinkly reflections and things like that. But I have to have a strong background so that those things work, and also a background that's not going to take too much away from that detail. There needs to be a kind of a real differentiation between the detailed and the not so detailed, the more plain background colour, because otherwise there's just going to be too much going on. It's going to be distracting for the eye, so there needs to be a real harmony between detail and the less detailed areas. I spoke a lot in my last video about the drippy bits, which I'm working on now. I'm calling them drippy bits, but really they're just more abstract areas of the painting. And I spoke about kind of roughly why I was doing that, and it was because it creates a nice harmony between detailed areas and not so detailed, more abstract elements of the piece, and that's something that has been really important to me in my work. So it's about looking at different elements of art and how they work together, and the idea of kind of combining the detailed and the not so detailed, and how much you can get away with that, and how it can look really, really interesting together and dynamic. So I am just building up the drippy detailed area at the moment, and I'm using those same colours that I have used for the sky and the background too. So it's not really about yet introducing new colours and sort of those explosions of oranges yet, but you will see me do that later. But it's more about creating a really nice background colour. I am creating some textures and some interest here as well by using the drip technique, which is where I really water down the paint, not actually with water because it's not water compatible, but with white spirit, and just really water it down and get those drips to sort of do a lot of the work for me and creating interest. As I said, this is a bit of a recap from what I did in my last video, but I thought it'd be interesting to see how this effect ties in with the rest of the painting and what it looks like in its context. So how the kind of final piece is going to look, and how I got there, and how you can do a painting with detail and also with abstraction, and without it looking too like it's two separate pieces, if you know what I mean, but combining those two into one piece. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm also, when I'm dripping, I'm also blowing on the paint too, and that creates a sort of a map effect where the paint bleeds out and almost looks like a map in the roads from like a distance. So I'm using that technique too. It can be really tempting here not to use too darker colours because it can look a bit intimidating, especially as none of the detail is in the image yet, and this is sort of the more concentrated area at the moment. So it can be a bit daring to do that, but it's really important to get the shading right here because it is the foreground, it is going to take a lot of the focus, and also, you know, it's abstract and it can't look too flat. It needs to be you know, detailed, there needs to be interest, there needs to be texture. So that's what I'm doing there. I'm doing that with the tones and the shading, as well as just with the paint and with the blowing technique and the dripping technique too. This is also a really good example of why it's important to have a very minimal background, and why that it can be overwhelming with too much going on in the background, because this is a really detailed section, and it's going to create a conversation between the detailed and the not so detailed areas of the piece, and that's what really is effective, so that it's not too busy, not too going on, and it's also not too sparse. So it's really about balance and harmony. My two favourite things to be talking about. But it really is. It's not just about the balance and harmony in terms of colour, it's also in terms of intensities. So a lot of things going on just to make sure that the piece works as a whole. Green and brown are probably quite common colours I use for the foreground areas, the drippy bits, and that is mainly because they are quite earthy colours and they just look really good as a foreground colour instead of just plain grass or, you know, something like that, but they help to give it a sort of more natural feel, less sort of claustrophobic and cityscape-ish, but a little bit more rural. So that's why I've used a lot of greens and browns and obviously the blues, and of course they all tie into the more cooler colours that I'm using for this piece, the yellows and the blues as well. Now you'll see in a sec that I'm going to add a real kick of colour, and that's going to be like an orangey red tone, and that is because it's a complementary colour to the blue, and it really stands out, and it just adds that a real pop of something to, you know, divert the attention away from just the centre and the sunset to you know, the foreground, and that in turn as well gives the eye a chance to look around the whole piece. So instead of just focusing on one thing, the viewer's eye sort of looks around the entire painting and sort of makes a journey from the centre where the sunset is all the way to the foreground in sort of a circular motion, and that embankment area that sort of whisks through that curve at the side really helps to dictate where the eye is going to go, and the movement as well of that viewing pattern. So it's going to sort of drag the eye forward into the foreground area. So I'm carrying on with the drips here and just really building up this detailed area, and it's important as well not to have too much sparseness, not too much detail as well. I keep talking about that balance of detail and less detail, but this area here is going to reflect the detail in the background with the bridges and the reflections, and there's just going to be those areas of kind of real detail and interest, which again is going to help the eye to move around the painting and absorb the different things going on. So I've moved here to the reflection area, and it's about kind of really creating a smoother texture here that's going to really contrast to the roughness of that foreground area that I've just done with the drippy bit. So those two things again create a conversation I was talking about earlier, not just between detail and less detail, but also against texture as well. So there's a textural conversation, there's interest because of the variation of texture as well. And this next part is really about me building up the forms of this area. So the lines here, the embankment lines, and just kind of outlining where the cityscape is going to form and where the sort of the pavement area is, and just kind of giving a little bit more form to otherwise quite an abstract piece. And you can see in my landscapes that I don't use that much form, so it's important to have these lines, which, I mean, there are a few of them, but they're really, really important to give structure to the piece as well, and say, well, you know, it's not just an abstract piece, there are some, you know, interesting things going on, and there's a clear structure to the work, and it's a clear setting. Those drippy bits on the side are going to create almost like shading. I use them as kind of, instead of just flat shading with the brush, they're almost they do create an element of shading because they are giving darkness to areas of the piece towards the outskirts. And yeah, it's just a really nice way of sort of adding interest instead of just flat shading, as I said. And you'll notice as it gets further towards the centre of the painting, where the sunset's happening, the drips get fewer and shorter and also a little bit lighter, so it really does create that gradation with tone and also with texture here as well. You can see here as well, once I've added some sort of drips, I do lighten them. I'm adding sort of lighter drips over the top, and that creates a really nice effect, because once you've got a dark drip with dark colours and you add a lighter drip on top of it, they sort of bleed into each other and create almost like a marble effect of light and dark, and that can be really, really interesting. But it's really only when you look up close to those really, really specific details that you can really see. But it's quite a nice touch that I like to do quite often. I'm just sort of reworking this whole area so that it looks like the other side. It's going to be like a mirror image, but not too, it's not exact, it's just sort of looking balanced at the sides. So I'm using images of London as well as other paintings I've seen or influences, and also my own work as well to create this image. And it's all kind of going on in my head at the moment, so I'm thinking about what I've seen in those pictures, and you know, occasionally referring back to the actual images of sort of bird's eye view of London, so just so I can get some kind of accuracy in it. So the little ports, and you know, where the boats are, and how sort of how the lights twinkle, and different buildings and things as well. So it's not absolutely accurate, but it is sort of my interpretation of that and how that all works together. So there are some shapes in there that you'll recognise, and some areas that can be identified. So at this point I'm just building up the areas of the embankment and the water's edge, so that I can, when I do those detailed reflections, I've got a base for them. I'm adding some sort of warmer browns in too, and that's to create a little bit of interest, a little bit of tonal variation, and also just shading, and yeah, just kind of forming a background for the buildings really as well, which you're going to see me start in a second. I haven't shown every single bit of the doing the buildings and adding those forms in, just because it is such a long process and takes so long, but I have done it in stages and taken photos for you to see. My usual process for this point is to outline the buildings quite lightly with very thin layer of paint. They're also quite geometric as well and quite square, so it's really important to get the perspectives right and the angles right. So I'm just sort of lining those out with my brush, and then I'll go over it with a palette knife. And you can see there that I've got loads and loads of buildings in the background, and they've all sort of been layered up, and I'm going to go over them at the end with some sort of splashes of colour and some dribbles and things so they don't look too severe. But the idea is to create contrast between the very, very detailed areas like the one that I have just done with all the buildings, and again the water reflections, the not so detailed bits. So that's why
there's a sort of, the bridge is going to be very detailed and the areas of the water are not, and also the sides are going to be very detailed with all the buildings and things, so it's just creating interest that way. You can see I've just added in that reflection. I'm doing that now with the light and the sunset, and it's interesting really because in the cityscapes it's not as important to the piece, it's not as sort of attention taking as, you know, some areas of this picture with the foreground and the cities, everything takes sort of a lot of attention, but with the seascapes it is the main focus is that sunset, so it's just really interesting to see how it's different from the other sort of style. You really see here how the picture's taking form with those twinkly lights make such a difference. They're just little dots of really light paint, almost white, white and yellow, and they make such a huge difference in really bringing the picture to life and making it look like things are going on, and it's a buzzy place and exciting, and so creating the effect of nighttime as well. So the more twinkly lights there are, the more it looks like the light is fading. So I see a close up there of the buildings that I've done, and I use the palette knife as well to give some sort of structure and also the 3D effect, the texture to the edges of the buildings and make them stand out. I'm now working on the bridges, and again this is going to be another area which is going to be really textural against the very flat background and the water and the reflections. You can see there how I've built up the bridge area, and it always kind of fades again into nothing. I've done a really real close up there of the little twinkly lights and things going on and how I'm smudging, and I think it's interesting to see the technique in close-up that I'm doing, and palette knife as well is so important here. The added paint there gives a sort of sense of texture and also looks like the water's almost lapping against the bottom of the bridge. And that is the finished work.
So there you go, that was how I created one of my cityscapes. I really hope that you enjoyed watching the video. Please like and subscribe, give it a thumbs up, comment, I will get back to you. And yeah, thank you so much. See you next week.